Welcome to this discussion of reading comprehension in the GMAT exam. So let's begin by talking about how reading comprehension just fits into the overall verbal section in terms of frequency. So always assume that you're going to see 4 reading comprehension passages of 3 to 4 questions each in every verbal section. It's not a guarantee, but it's a likely bet that you'll see 4. You will see at minimum 3, but very most likely 4. Rare occasions you can get to 5, but again, exceedingly rare. So just plan for 4 passages of 3 to 4 questions each. You also want to allocate a minimum of 5 minutes per passage to properly address the questions. It is definitely the case that in the reading comprehension, you really have to engage with the passages in order to understand what's happening and properly answer the questions. So it isn't a good idea to try to rush these questions necessarily. Additionally, you can see reading comprehension as a part of the integrated reasoning multi-source reasoning questions. These are the ones that have multiple tabs, and within those tabs you will apply many of the same techniques that we will be discussing here today regarding reading comprehension in that usually somewhat less important portion of the GMAT. Now, your strategic implications. You want to spend approximately a minute 45 per question within the verbal as it pertains to the reading comprehension. And this is the closest to the average for each question on the verbal section in total. Each question on the verbal should take somewhere around a minute 48, a minute 50, and reading comprehension you want to be most closely aligned with that minute 50 or just a little bit less than a minute 50 question pace for the 65-minute verbal section. In the integrated reasoning, however, because the multi-source reasoning questions just have so much information within those tabs, you could spend about 3 minutes per question for those questions in the integrated reasoning section. Now, you want to allocate a maximum of 4 minutes to complete a full read of any passage and the first question. And that, again, applies similarly to the integrated reasoning multi-source with the tabs. Take your time to understand what you're reading. And if you are the type of individual who really needs to upfront understand the information in total rather than reading on a more targeted basis, take the time to do so. And you can spend up to this 4-minute maximum to just address the first question and guarantee that you understand what is happening in the passage. You'll also want to take notes as you go to allow your reading comprehension for one question potentially to assist with another. The reading comprehension passages from a theoretical perspective on the GMAT, they have more questions that they can show you than you'll actually see on the GMAT in most cases. So that means that if you're looking at a passage, you'll see 3 to 4 questions, but there might actually be as many as 7 or 8 possible to see for that passage. And the exam is savvy enough as part of its adaptivity function to decide properly about whether you got a question right or wrong. And if you got a question wrong, it may ask you a question building on the one you just missed. Concurrently, if you got a question right, it may, to a degree, reward you a little bit by allowing you to answer another question based on that same topic or that same area within the passage, especially based on your pacing and where you are and how much time remains in the section. So it really is important to take notes and potentially leverage those notes from a prior question for one of the other questions on that passage. And because these questions tend to build on each other and you have to understand the passage in its entirety, this is the last type of question you're going to want to proactively skip. So reading comprehension, you don't want to punt on questions. Now, obviously, if you are behind time and you find yourself going back and forth on 2 answer choices, you'll have to eventually move on to maintain that pace of about a minute 45 per question. But you don't want to rush and cut corners on an entire passage because very quickly 1 incorrect on reading comprehension can become 2, 3, or 4 incorrect on a reading comprehension, and you don't want to exacerbate the problem by missing that many questions on one passage. So try to skip the other types, some sentence corrections, some critical reasonings if you're behind pace on the verbal, or behind pace on the integrated reasoning, you'll want to consider skipping probably those two-part analyses questions, just because very quickly you'll end up missing a bunch of questions on a single passage as opposed to other question types in either section that only impact an individual question at a time. So let's look at how reading comprehension is going to be presented in the verbal section. So on the left-hand side, you can see we've got a static reading comprehension passage. And on the right-hand side, you'll have those 3 to 4 rotating question tasks. Now, on the GMAT, they don't actually tell you how many questions are tied to a passage up front. This is actually a negative compared to some other standardized tests where they will tell you, okay, the next 3 or 4 questions are tied to this passage, which is why you just have to assume you're probably going to see 3 to 4. Now, these question tasks, you're going to want to read the passage's first question to identify the subject and determine how much upfront reading may be needed. So the subjects are either going to be tied to the passage in its entirety, or they're going to reference a specific term or location. Now, earlier and longer passages, or broad subject first question passages, are more likely to benefit from an upfront read and a passage map of notes. And we'll talk about what the passage map looks like here momentarily. But you want to recognize that, again, earlier questions matter more, whether it's on the quantitative section or the verbal section, just because of the adaptivity function of the exam. So it's incumbent upon you to potentially allocate more time earlier. And of course, if you've got a broad subject first question, you also have to keep that in mind as you allocate your time. Now, later and shorter passages, or where you have a first question referencing a specific term or location, targeted reading can be more effective and efficient here. And the exam, again, really rewards flexibility in approach. So some passages you may need to understand in their entirety because the first question is asking about primary purpose. Others may only ask 3 or 4 questions about specific term or location references. And those ones, you might benefit from both a pacing and an accuracy perspective if you work to just focus specifically on the terms and locations that they're asking about. But if you are going to do that targeted reading, always read full sentences and always read at least one sentence above and below a term or location reference to ensure that you're getting the proper context. Don't assume that you can get by, especially by just reading the phrase that includes the term or reading the phrase that includes that location, line 15, or just the highlight, because frequently they'll deal with the highlight. You want to make sure that you are reading enough context and err on the side of a larger window rather than a smaller one, just to make sure that you're getting the information that's necessary to address the task. So, a broad subject question is pretty straightforward. It's going to ask about the passage overall. And we've got a sample here just asking the primary purpose of the passage is to. So whenever you're asked about primary purpose, it's basically saying, why did the author write it? And you'll always have 5 answer choices here, A through E. We'll look at these in greater detail in a moment, but assuming that this is maybe an earlier passage, say passage 1 or 2 in the section, and we're clearly being asked about the passage overall, let's assume that we're going to engage with a passage map. So what is a passage map? So you're going to want to read a paragraph or approximately 10 lines of text. Just read it, just understand it, and then stop to consider what you've read. Don't take notes abstractly and to a degree haphazardly as you go. You want to actually reflect upon the information and take a brief note capturing the main subject and action of that excerpt, the paragraph or approximately 10 lines, so that you know what you've said and you've summarized it, or what you've read and you've summarized it, basically. Then you want to attempt to maintain your primary subject and or action from note to note that you take over the course of the passage, again, every 10 lines or approximately a paragraph, to create an overall narrative for your notes from the passage. So you're like, okay, if we're talking about item X, we've got to make sure that item X maintains throughout the passage map that you're creating. And if the main subject or action changes unexpectedly, do revisit your prior note to confirm that you captured the main actor or action, because if you lost it, that may be just because they brought in some introductory background information and kind of took a right turn. And that can be one of the things that they like to do in somewhat tougher passages. Just the idea of giving you a little bit of background information, making you think that it's about one thing, and then focusing just on like one specific aspect of that background information. And you can also consider an overall summary once you've written out all of your notes and read through the whole passage as a prediction for your primary purpose or main idea question, if that's what you're going to address as the first question for the passage, or just to have it in your back pocket for a possible later later primary purpose or main idea question. Because the main idea and primary purpose question, 9 times out of 10, if it shows up for a passage, is going to be either first or last. And so even if you're doing some more specific term or location reference questions earlier on, you may still want to take an overall summary as your prediction of the main idea in its entirety, just in case later on, question 3, question 4 might be a primary purpose. So let's consider the passage map here from this reading comprehension passage. So beginning up top, the public health and economic efficiency approaches to choosing a role for government often reach opposite conclusions. From the public health perspective, the potential for illness or injury is sufficient to justify government action. Large numbers of deaths or illnesses are more compelling reasons for government action. The dollar values of benefits and costs derived from government programs does not necessarily enter the public health decision calculus. So at this point, I'm roughly around 10 lines in this paragraph, and we can see a transition of alternatively coming up. So this is probably a good place to take a note. And we'll just summarize some of these, or abbreviate some of these key terms, like public health and economic efficiency, using their initials. So public health becomes PH, EE stands for economic efficiency, and we see from the beginning, PH and EE have opposite conclusions. And that's the first sentence. And we know that PH does not require cost-benefit analysis, just illness or injury when it comes to these government programs. You're not looking for something comprehensive. You can see this is shorthanded on right around 15 words. And on the exam, if you're taking the GMAT online, you can actually type your notes using a little pop-out online whiteboard. If you prefer typing them, of course, you can also write them handwritten. So just some flexibility there in terms of whether you'd like to write with your keyboard or handwritten. Whatever's fastest for you is going to be best, and you'll practice that with some practice drills and online practice exams to figure out what's best for you before your test day. So then we pick up after that summary, and we learn that alternatively, economic efficiency demands that proposed government programs clear 2 hurdles. First, there must be an efficiency problem for government to solve. Second, a corrective program must be worth the cost. So again, we just build on what we've already written out of PH and EE. So we said earlier, PH does not require cost-benefit analysis, just illness or injury. We now know that the economic efficiency requires that government programs must solve an efficiency problem and be worth the cost. There's those 2 qualifications. So again, we summarize the entire first paragraph of this relatively dense passage in 2 bullets. So then we move on, hopefully continuing on this idea of what PH and EE do for these government programs. So far, economists have not reached a consensus on whether obesity raises economic efficiency problems. If obesity results from informed individuals willingly making diet and lifestyle choices, there's no way to argue for inefficiency. It must be concluded that many are willing to accept extra weight because the cost of diet and exercise is too high. So, we have got this idea, again, that economists basically aren't really able to say anything about obesity. So, economists, no consensus on obesity, raising EE problems, and if obesity is from choice, there's no EE issue. Again, got it all summarized, and we've got this transition again of on the other hand coming up, so that tells me that even though it's on the shorter end of my 10 lines kind of some assumption for taking a note, I know the next part is kind of in contrast, so I'll just take my note there. On the other hand, arguments for intervention could be mounted on the basis of imperfect information about the relationship between diet and health. Nevertheless, many in the public health community have proposed interventions, and taxing snack foods has been advocated frequently, but without a clear statement of the efficiency problem caused by being overweight and obesity, we cannot say whether such taxes might increase or decrease economic efficiency, i.e., whether benefits exceed costs. So, we've got this idea, maybe my longest sentence or note so far, that government intervention argument for obesity, it can be made, but without clear facts, you can't determine the outcome of such a program. So again, we've just got all of these, kind of disparate ideas about public health and economic efficiency approaches to potentially having the government step in about obesity. And that functions as our main idea prediction. Evaluate the pH and EE needs to fight obesity. Tied into government, but again, just a relatively short summary here that these notes will then hopefully help you with the remaining questions even after the first. So we'll bring back in our initial broad subject question. Primary purpose of the passage, and we know our prediction is to evaluate the pH and EE needs in fighting obesity. So now we've got our answer choices, and we want to compare those against this prediction while also seeking actions and descriptions that we know don't match what we just read and mapped. So choice A, advocate for a change in public health policy. Well, the author is not making any sort of certain statements about what public health policy should be. If anything, the author is equivocating a lot. So we cannot say in that final sentence whether taxes about snack foods would increase or decrease economic efficiency, which was clearly part of the calculus here. So there's no change that we could say is certainly being advocated for. Similarly, with choice B, there is no governmental action that has been justified. There was no government action that was even known to be necessary or supported. So that, again, too strong of a statement for this relatively ambiguous passage. We also don't actually examine any possible causes for the public weight excess. We know that there is clearly some issue of obesity and people being overweight in this society, but we don't know what the cause was, so we can eliminate choice C for that. Now, argue that health concerns supersede economic consensus. Again, the author does not argue anything. The author just states a bunch of facts and says that we don't know what to do with them necessarily. Which leaves us with choice E, which says consider variables impacting government decision making. And we have those throughout this passage, even though the answer choice is incredibly bland and doesn't use our key terms like economics or economists or efficiency or public health. It's all about just using bland paraphrasing that's relatively unattractive, but also unassailably true. So this is how you can work through a broad subject primary purpose question using a passage map. So now let's take a look at a specific subject question. And oftentimes in the GMAT, they'll actually highlight the term or location that is being referred to. And in this case, we've got the author most likely mentions taxing snack foods in order to. So you can see the highlight down here on the left-hand side. And remember, we always want to go at least a sentence above and a sentence below. But if we go back, we see on the other hand. So if I'm coming in on the other hand, I probably want to take another sentence backwards to make sure that I understand why the author mentions taxing snack foods. So we just go up to the top and we reread, and since we're rereading, we don't really need to go in full detail, but we remember that obesity results from informed individuals willingly making these choices. And if that happens, then you can't argue for inefficiency. But on the other hand, we've got arguments that could be mounted on the imperfect information, and even with this imperfect information, from the economic perspective, there's many in the public health community proposing interventions on behalf of the obese and the overweight, and taxing snack foods has been advocated frequently. But we know without a clear statement of the economics of it, we can't say whether those taxes would affect economic efficiency and meet those demands from the prior paragraph. So if we're going to come up with our own prediction here, it might be something like cite a possible public health government obesity intervention, because that's what taxing snack foods are. They're an example. So now we go to our choices. And again, just as before, the passage is not recommending any course of action, nor does it mention anything about raising government revenues. And beware of bringing outside information or bias into your evaluation of reading comprehension passages, because you may say to yourself, raising revenues sounds like a good thing for a government to do. Sure, but it's not why the author of this passage mentions the taxing of snack foods. Then with choice B, we've got cite a policy that is likely to reduce public obesity. We don't know that it's likely to reduce the public obesity. We just know that it's one that has been advocated frequently. Again, we're not proposing an alternative health intervention. An alternative to what? There's no alternative, so this is not why the author introduced the idea of taxing snack foods. But choice D, identify a method of diet improvement that has support. Well, that matches our prediction, because the public health community is the support, and taxing snack foods is a method of diet improvement. So again, while it's a relatively bland answer, unassailably matches our prediction and is definitely supported as far as a reason the author introduces this idea of taxing snack foods. And again, the author has no position here, so there's no defense of the economist's lack of consensus, even though there clearly is a lack of consensus by the economists as seen earlier in this paragraph. So again, you can see how to work through a specific subject question as well, and these are the question types that will basically be rotating throughout a reading comprehension passage. So the first step of the reading comprehension process is, of course, going to be to identify the question task. And you want to read each question as you go to determine its subject and task. So again, is it targeted, where you could just go look for a term or location, or is it broad, asking about the passage overall and what are you being asked to do with the information? Then you want to read what you need to address that subject and task. So if it's a broad subject and or the first question of the passage, you'll be more likely to consider a full upfront read and notes. And if it's a specific subject and or not the first question, you'll do targeted reading. And it's an important caveat to note that you don't want to do a passage map after the first question. It's just not going to be in your best interest to work through a main idea, primary purpose, full passage map on question 3. It's going to throw off your pacing. So only do that broad passage map for question 1 if you're going to choose to do one. And then step 3, of course, is going to be to make a prediction on your own so as to avoid being tricked by those intentionally convoluted and appealing answer choices that may include things like recycled language or terms that you recall or are hoping to prey on your own implicit biases. And you'll do that by just predicting what the answer should do to address whatever the question task wanted you to find from the passage. And then, of course, is going to be process of elimination as the final step. So you want to focus on actions and descriptions for objective reasons to eliminate. Just as we did before, you could see that we were highlighting verbs, we were highlighting adjectives, we were highlighting adverbs, because all of those things provide objective reasons to eliminate that are not going to be able to be argued against. And if you are down to 2 in the process of elimination for reading comprehension, you want to default to selecting the option with fewer direct terms from the passage and a less absolute claim. By default, assume that the correct answer is going to be relatively bland and unappealing, so you want to go bland when considering 2 answer choices that are kind of ambiguous for you at the end of your reading comprehension process. So, building on what we just did, let's go take a look at a couple of reading comprehension examples and how you'll engage with them on the actual GMAT. Okay, let's take a look at another passage involving the Hubble Space Telescope. So, always read the question first And in this case, we can see that we're being asked once again, what is the author primarily concerned with? So on the exam, I would probably consider this as an opportunity to take an upfront passage map of the passage, again, looking at it either approximately 10 lines or a paragraph, and then taking some notes. So let's do that here now. So possibly the most critical factor in the Hubble Space Telescope's tremendous success has to do with the manner in which it is operated. Hubble is a public facility observatory open for use by any astronomer from around the world. Each year, an announcement goes out to the worldwide community soliciting research proposals for use of Hubble and its instrumentation. That instrumentation is a complementary set of cameras, spectrographs, and other more specialized devices, such as stellar coronagraphs and interferometers. Now, at this point, I'm saying to myself, this is just giving me a bunch of information about the Hubble, so I don't necessarily see a need to split this paragraph into two, and we'll just keep going. So it, meaning the Hubble, is extremely versatile and covers a wide range of performance characteristics, such as sensitivity, resolution, and wavelength coverage. Taken together, the Hubble instruments provide essentially a complete toolbox for astronomers to utilize in attacking almost any problem in modern optical astronomy. So basically, if we're just summarizing this as, we'll just call it the HST passage map. And remember that on the online exam, you will have the capacity of potentially using a text box, or if you're in person, obviously you'll have to handwrite it, or you can handwrite it on your scratch board on the online exam as well. So for this passage map, we can just call this paragraph 1, and we'll just say that HST for Hubble Space Telescope is used by the whole world and is a near total astronomy tool. Again, we don't need to be overly specific, and nothing really goes contrast here, which is really the main occasion that you'll want to change your approach with the passage map. So I just leave paragraph 1 as this. We just got, HST is used by the whole world and is a near total astronomy tool. Simple enough. So then we keep on going. Hubble observations have yielded major advances in virtually every area of astronomy and astrophysics. The mechanism by which this is achieved is the open proposal, solicitation, peer review, and selection process that brings into the Hubble Research Program observers from the entire international astronomical community. The demand for Hubble observing time is huge. In a typical proposal cycle, approximately 5 or 6 times as much observing time is requested as is available. Many extremely worthy research proposals are rejected each cycle simply because there's not nearly enough time on the telescope to go around. Only the very best scientific ideas put forward by the community find their way onto Hubble's observing schedule. So again, pretty straightforward. Don't need to split this in my estimation. So we just say HST is so in demand, many worthy proposals don't get to use. And remember that since we're being asked about what the author is primarily concerned with, we can just have a broad prediction here for ourselves, saying something to the effect of describe the HST benefits and how/who gets to use. So again, nothing overly descriptive, but that will work as we consider what the author is primarily concerned with. Now, on the exam, I would certainly write out the answer choices for process of elimination, but here we'll just focus on what makes an answer choice correct or incorrect. So, comparing against our prediction, publicizing an exploratory resource. And obviously that resource is the Hubble Space Telescope. And I might say, we might hold this just because it seems vaguely relevant, vaguely similar. It's not perfect. It doesn't really talk about the benefits and how and who gets to use it. And we don't necessarily know about publicizing specifically, but seems broadly in the right area. Now, marketing the Hubble Space Telescope. Are we actually marketing it? I'd say no, and that seems extreme. And when we compare marketing to publicizing, they're basically the same thing. And if you've got two answer choices that say the same thing, they both have to be wrong. So A, even though it seemed reasonable, can be eliminated for that reason. Now, explaining the utility and uses of a tool. Again, that tool is the Hubble Space Telescope, and that seems pretty darn good to me. So we'll hold on to that. Identifying valid space research, though. Well, we don't actually say what valid space research is in this passage. So that seems extreme, and while we know that some valid space research doesn't get to use the Hubble Space Telescope, saying that we know what is valid space research probably goes a bit too far. And rejecting the actual proposals, again, we know that proposals are rejected, which is what may make this seem appealing for a moment. But the author herself or herself is certainly not rejecting the proposals individually, and we can confidently select C for this question. So now, let's move on, and we'll take a look at a slightly different but similar question. On the exam itself, you would keep your notes from the passage map, and hopefully the sheer action of working through the passage map would improve your understanding of things in their entirety. Now, here we can see that we're being asked, according to the passage, which of the following is a consideration in selecting a project to use the Hubble Space Telescope? So we want to seek this key phrase or term of consideration in selecting a project. Because the whole passage, we recall, is about the Hubble Space Telescope, and we know that the selecting of the project, that comes in paragraph 2 from the effort that we did with our passage mapping. So now we've got to go into the passage here, and we've got to go find where we're talking about the selection process. And I see it right here. So our selection process, we need to go at least a sentence above and a sentence below so that we get the full relevant information. And we're going to go ahead and predict what the answer should be based on these surrounding sentences. So we'll go ahead and pick up right here. And we'd want to go at least through a sentence below. So we'll go right there. And so we read, Hubble observations have yielded major advances in virtually every area of astronomy and astrophysics. The mechanism by which this is achieved is the open proposal solicitation, peer review, and selection process that brings into the Hubble Research Program observers from the entire international astronomical community. The demand for Hubble observing time is huge. In a typical proposal cycle, approximately 5 or 6 times as much observing time is requested as is available. So probably good enough to stop there. And so, again, we'll just type it out for ease of use here. And again, you'll have the option of potentially typing out on your own. But we see that Hubble observations, we know, yielded major advances. And the selection process specifically, it's an open solicitation. And we know that there's peer review and observers from the international astro community. And that there is with large demand. And we don't need to get into the 5 or 6 times as much observing time. We just know that there's high demand. So now we got to go through these answer choices, looking for reasons to eliminate or to say that an answer choice matches. So, looking at choice A first, proof that similar experimentation has already yielded major astronomical advances. Well, we're not comparing similar experimentation. And while this phrase of yielded major astronomical advances may seem similar and familiar, it's a trap, because it's hoping that you just remember that phrasing and select it, even though we don't need proof that similar experimentation has yielded these advances to be selected as a project for the Hubble Space Telescope. So choice A is eliminated. Validation of a project's worthiness by disinterested contemporary scientists. So we've got to break apart some rather strange terminology, but validation would be a review. And we're talking about the project's worthiness, well, that would tie into the peer review that we were talking about. And disinterested does not mean not interested. It means without bias. And so we'd be looking at people who are able to make decisions, and those contemporary scientists are those from the entire international astronomical community. So even though it's bland and seemingly unattractive, this matches our prediction pretty nicely. So we definitely hold that with a check. Now, governmental sponsorship identifying a specific public need to be addressed. Well, we're not talking about governmental sponsorship nor a public need, so neither of those match the passage. Affirmation of plans to use a limited amount of the telescope's resources. Again, we say that the resources are limited, but we don't say that if you show you're only going to use a little bit of the telescope's tools that you'll get to use them. So that's not matching what is stated either. So you can again just kind of say not a match. And project rejection in a prior Hubble Space Telescope proposal cycle. While many do get rejected, we don't know that that rejection actually leads to being accepted in a future cycle. So again, all of these things are ultimately not supported except for B, and both of these examples show how you'll want to engage with reading comprehension on the actual GMAT, and now would be a good time to go and practice some more reading comprehension practice problems on your own through drills and possibly practice sections.